Marsha Wilson gripped the steering wheel tighter. Her palms damp as she watched the city skyline draw closer. She'd driven this stretch countless times in her mind. But today was different, today was real. Today, she wasn't just another black woman rolling into a new city. She was the new chief of police, chosen to lead a precinct rooted in traditions that didn't exactly welcome change. Especially not from someone who looked like her. The morning sun cast a warm glow on the road. But Marsha felt anything but warmth. This city had a reputation. One that trailed her every move since her appointment was announced. The precinct, filled with hardened officers used to doing things a certain way, had barely hidden their disapproval. It was a challenge she'd known was coming. Yet the weight of it settled heavy on her shoulders. She'd fought her way up through countless ranks. Faced barriers she wasn't meant to break through. And yet here she was. The very thought made her heart race, equal parts fear and fierce determination. As she crossed the city limits, memories surfaced of the countless times she'd been underestimated, passed over, scrutinized more than her peers. But she'd turned each of those moments into fuel. She was ready for this. At least, that's what she told herself with every heartbeat. But today wasn't a day for nerves, it was a day to make her presence known. The stakes had never been higher. Not just for her, but for everyone who would look to her as a symbol of what could be achieved. Suddenly, a flicker of red and blue lights appeared in her rearview mirror. The flashing colors threw her back into an old, familiar place. One where the people in those lights were anything but allies. A sinking feeling took root in her stomach. But she maintained her composure. She'd prepared herself for moments like these. Yet a part of her hoped they wouldn't come, not here. Not on her first day. Marsha slowed to a stop, watching as two white officers stepped out of their cruiser. She watched them approach. Their strides confident. Their faces set. She took a deep breath, steadying herself, telling herself that this was nothing more than a routine stop. But deep down, she knew better. It was never just a stop. Not when you looked like her. And not here, where her very presence would disrupt the status quo. She rolled down her window and looked up at the officers, bracing for the familiar line of questioning. But as they spoke, their words, casual but cutting, reminded her exactly why she was here. The officer's gaze was cold and calculating as he leaned down to her window, his eyes narrowing. "License and registration," he demanded, his voice carrying an edge that bristled with arrogance. His partner stood back, arms crossed, exuding an air of superiority. To them, she was just another woman on the road. Another person to be questioned, another person to control. Marsha handed over her documents without a word. But inside, her patience was wearing thin. This wasn't the first time she'd been stopped for routine checks. She'd grown accustomed to the looks, the tones, the doubts about her right to be anywhere. Much less here, in her own car, on the edge of her new city. But today, she felt the weight of it heavier than ever. The senior officer flipped through her paperwork with an exaggerated slowness, like he was savoring the moment, searching for something that would give him reason to delay her further. His silence was deafening, a deliberate choice meant to make her feel out of place, to remind her that here, on this road, he was in control. His partner, a younger officer with a nervous twitch in his jaw, looked on with a smug expression, feeding off the power dynamics in the air. "You from around here?" The younger officer finally broke the silence, his tone thick with suspicion. "Don't see many people like you on this stretch of road." His words cut through the air, unmasking the bias that clung to him like a second skin. Marsha clenched her jaw, steadying herself as she took in his words. She felt the anger pulse through her veins but suppressed it, knowing that any sign of frustration would only feed their prejudice. Her mind raced with possible responses, ways to assert her authority without revealing her position just yet. But the choice weighed on her. Should she assert her identity, pull rank, and end this charade? Or should she let them continue? Let them expose the very mindset she was here to challenge? "I'm on my way to work," she replied evenly, her voice steady and calm. She met his gaze head-on, refusing to shrink beneath the pressure they so clearly wanted to apply. The officer wasn't satisfied. His lip curled in an almost imperceptible sneer as he exchanged a look with his partner. "And what kind of work would that be?" His tone was mocking, laced with an accusation he didn't bother to hide. They were pushing her, baiting her, trying to find a crack in her calm. She felt a bitter irony creep over her. Here she was, the newly appointed chief of police, being interrogated by her own officers on her first day. It would have been almost laughable if it weren't so telling. This was exactly why she'd accepted this position. Why she'd fought so hard to be here. She didn't just want to lead a department, she wanted to change it from the inside out. And if this encounter was any indication, she had her work cut out for her. Her patience stretched thin, and she found herself taking a slow, deliberate breath. She could feel their eyes on her. Assessing. Doubting. Testing. But she held her ground, allowing the silence to linger just a moment longer before she finally spoke. "You'll find out soon enough," she said. Her voice calm but laced with an undertone that demanded respect. She watched their faces shift, a flicker of confusion crossing the senior officer's features as he sensed a subtle authority in her words. But it wasn't enough to deter him. He wasn't ready to back down just yet. "Well, maybe we need to detain you for further questioning," he replied, his tone as condescending as it was arrogant. He looked down at her as though daring her to challenge him, fully confident in the power he wielded. Marsha felt a decision snap into place within her, a moment of clarity she could no longer ignore. Enough was enough. She straightened her posture, looked him squarely in the eyes, and delivered the truth in a tone that cut through the air like steel. "That won't be necessary, officer. I'm Marsha Wilson," she said, pausing just long enough to let the words sink in. "Your new chief of police." The silence was instant, thickening the air around them as her words settled over the two men. Their faces paled, eyes widening with a stunned realization that seemed to freeze them in place. The smugness, the arrogance, gone in an instant, replaced by a stunned disbelief that left them speechless. The senior officer stammered, his voice barely a whisper. You're the chief?" "Yes," she replied firmly, holding his gaze with an unflinching resolve. "And I'd like to know why you stopped me and felt the need to question me like this." Both officers stood there, paralyzed, their authority slipping from their hands as the weight of their actions finally hit them. Marsha watched them, her heart steady, knowing that this encounter was only the beginning. She had a city to change, a department to lead, and officers like these to hold accountable. But for now, she let the silence linger, watching them grapple with the reality they'd created, knowing that today, they weren't just dealing with any citizen, they were answering to their new boss. Marsha stepped into the precinct that morning with the kind of calm that belied a storm beneath. Word of her roadside encounter had spread faster than she'd expected. The air was thick with tension as she walked through the hallway, officers glancing up, quickly looking away, unsure of what to make of their new chief. Her presence, the quiet intensity in her gaze, had already begun to stir something, a shift that would be felt by everyone in the room. She could feel the weight of their stares, their questions unspoken but palpable. Some regarded her with skepticism, others with outright defiance, and a few with something that looked almost like hope. Marsha knew this wasn't just a job to them, it was a fortress. A place where they'd long held power unchallenged, where they'd been free to operate by rules that had gone unquestioned. Until now. Taking a deep breath, Marsha pushed open the doors to the briefing room. Inside, a sea of blue uniforms turned toward her, a mix of curious and wary faces awaiting her first words. She walked to the front of the room, her heels echoing against the floor, and turned to face them, meeting their eyes one by one. Silence blanketed the room, thick with expectation. She was aware of every pulse in the room, every held breath, and the simmering tension that crackled like static. Clearing her throat, Marsha began with a voice steady and clear, unyielding in its resolve. "Good morning, officers. My name is Marsha Wilson, and as many of you now know, I am your new chief of police." She paused, allowing the gravity of her words to settle, and noticed a few heads lower, some eyes shifting uncomfortably. "I didn't come here just to sit behind a desk. I came here to lead, to serve, and to ensure that every person who wears this uniform understands the responsibility that comes with it." Her gaze swept across the room, catching every officer in her line of sight, making sure they felt the weight of her words. "Yesterday," she continued, "2 officers pulled me over. They questioned my right to be on the road, my purpose in this city, and they did it with an attitude that suggested their authority was absolute. And all this was before they knew who I was." A ripple of discomfort spread through the room, a few officers shifting in their seats, exchanging nervous glances. Marsha allowed the tension to breathe, pressing on. "Let me be clear, that encounter could have been with anyone. I could have been your mother, your sister, your neighbor. It should not take knowing my position for an officer to treat me, or anyone else, with respect and professionalism." She saw a few heads nod slightly, as if some part of them wanted to agree, while others bristled, resisting this new reality she was laying out. Marsha continued, her tone growing firmer. "I am not here to destroy what this department stands for, I am here to elevate it. To bring it back to what it should stand for: justice, integrity, and trust. But know this, accountability is not negotiable. From this day forward, there will be no room for bias, no room for reckless authority, and certainly no room for prejudice in how we serve this community." A few officers shifted uncomfortably, but her words held them in place. grounding them in an honesty they couldn't escape. She watched as the expressions on their faces began to soften. Some with understanding, others with grudging acceptance. For some, her words were a direct challenge to the culture they'd known. But for others, it was a breath of much-needed change. In the coming days, each one of you will be trained, evaluated, and expected to meet the standards we're setting here today. And yes, I will be watching. Her gaze sharpened, letting the words sink in, feeling the weight of the silence that now blanketed the room. This is not a threat, it's a promise. If you're here to serve, if you're here to protect, you'll find me to be your strongest ally. But if you're here for power, for control, or anything less than the duty this badge demands, then let me make it clear, your time here is running out. She could see the message landing, the reality dawning in the eyes of her officers. A few heads nodded more confidently, expressions shifting to something that looked like respect, even admiration. Others remained stiff, their jaws tight. But she knew she'd planted a seed. It was a start. Pausing, Marsha let out a slow breath, softening her tone. I believe in this department. I believe that, together, we can make it something this community can trust. But that trust has to be earned. And that starts today, with each and every one of you. With those words, she stepped back, the silence around her thick, charged with the promise of change. She knew that this was just the beginning, that she had a long road ahead, and that resistance would come. But as she looked into the faces of her officers, she saw something she hadn't expected, a glimmer of belief. And she knew that, despite the battles to come, she was exactly where she was meant to be. The days following Marsha's address to the precinct were marked by an unmistakable tension that simmered just beneath the surface. She felt it the moment she walked in each morning. A quiet resistance in the way some officers barely nodded at her, while others avoided her gaze altogether. But Marsha was no stranger to pushback, she had faced it at every stage of her career. And this was no different. It was merely a new battlefield. And she was more than prepared to stand her ground. In the first week, Marsha instituted mandatory training sessions, designed to address issues of bias, community engagement, and de-escalation tactics. The officers filed into the training room reluctantly, some rolling their eyes, others muttering under their breath. Marsha ignored their defiance, watching with a steady gaze as they took their seats, one by one. The first session was led by a respected former officer from a neighboring precinct, a man known for his impartiality and insight. He spoke plainly about the importance of fairness, the dangers of prejudice, and the responsibility they all shared in fostering trust. Marsha watched as the officers shifted in their seats, some visibly disinterested, while others showed signs of reflection. She could see the wheels turning, but she knew that breaking down ingrained beliefs wouldn't happen overnight. During the breaks, she made it a point to walk among them, striking up conversations, getting to know their names, their stories. Some responded with terse answers, barely masking their reluctance. Others softened slightly, offering details about their families, their backgrounds. Marsha knew that trust was a two-way street, and while she was here to hold them accountable, she also wanted them to know she was invested in them. But there were some, like Officer Randall Pierce, who made it clear they were anything but open to her presence. Pierce was a tall, broad-shouldered officer with a history in the precinct that stretched back nearly 2 decades. Known for his tough approach and deeply ingrained loyalty to the way things were, he wasn't shy about letting Marsha know that he saw her changes as a direct attack on his principles. One afternoon, after a training session, he approached her in the hallway, his expression dark and foreboding. "Chief Wilson," he began. The words clipped, barely veiling his disapproval. "Some of us don't see the need for all this bureaucracy. We know our jobs. And we know this city. We've been here a lot longer than you." Marsha met his gaze, her face calm, betraying none of the frustration she felt simmering beneath. "Officer Pierce, I respect the experience you bring to this department," she replied evenly. "But experience doesn't exempt any of us from accountability. If we're not willing to evolve, then we're failing the people we've sworn to protect." Pierce let out a short, humorless laugh, crossing his arms over his chest. "Is that what you call it? Evolving? I call it bending over backwards to please people who don't understand what it's like out there." Marsha took a steadying breath, her voice remaining firm. "Our job isn't just to enforce the law, it's to build trust. If the people don't feel safe coming to us, then we've lost our purpose. And I won't allow this department to be anything less than a place of integrity." Pierce's jaw tightened, but he said nothing more. She could see in his eyes that he was still unwilling to yield, still holding on to his resentment, his refusal to accept her leadership. But she wasn't here to win everyone over, she was here to set a new standard. And if some couldn't meet it, then they would find themselves left behind. As the weeks progressed, Marsha's reforms began to take shape. She implemented a new system of reports for traffic stops and detainments, requiring each officer to document their reasons for each action and submit them for review. The process was met with groans and eye rolls. But Marsha was undeterred. Every morning, she read through each report carefully, looking for patterns, seeking out any signs of prejudice or misconduct. One evening, just as she was about to leave, Marsha received a report from a junior officer, Officer Tyler Jennings. Tyler was one of the few who had openly expressed his support for her new policies. And his report detailed an incident where he'd intervened in a situation where another officer had escalated a routine stop. Marsha felt a surge of pride as she read his account, his words echoing her own values of fairness and respect. The next day, Marsha called Tyler into her office. He entered hesitantly, his face a mix of curiosity and nerves. She gestured for him to sit, offering him a small smile. "I read your report," she began. "And I want you to know that what you did out there, it matters. You intervened because you saw something that didn't align with our values. And that's exactly what this department needs." Tyler's eyes brightened, and he nodded, his voice steady but grateful. "Thank you, Chief. I want to believe we can be better." Marsha smiled, feeling a swell of hope she hadn't anticipated. "We can. And we will." But not all of the officers shared Tyler's optimism. In the locker room, whispers circulated about Marsha's agenda, resentment growing among the ones who saw her as a threat to their authority. She knew these rumblings existed, that some still clung to the old ways. But she remained unwavering in her mission. One day, as she walked through the precinct, Marsha overheard a group of officers talking in hushed tones. She paused, listening as one officer muttered, "Maybe if she stopped acting like she owns the place, things would be different." Marsha felt a flicker of hurt, but she pushed it aside. She'd come here for a purpose, and she couldn't afford to let their opinions derail her. Leadership wasn't about popularity, it was about resilience. About making decisions that others might resist because they disrupted the comfort of tradition. As she returned to her office, Marsha felt the weight of it all settle on her shoulders. A heaviness that only those who dared to challenge the status quo could understand. But she refused to be shaken. Every day, every difficult conversation, every strained glance, these were reminders of why she was here. Of the work that needed to be done. Sitting at her desk, Marsha took a deep breath, steadying herself. She knew this was only the beginning, that there would be more battles, more resistance. But as she looked out her window at the precinct, she was slowly transforming. She felt a spark of hope. She was here to make a difference, no matter the cost. And she was determined to see it through. The precinct's changes did not stay confined within its walls. Marsha's reforms were stirring up conversations across the city. Some saw her as a force for good, a leader unafraid to tackle the hard truths that had gone unspoken for too long. Others viewed her as an outsider disrupting the natural order, a sentiment that echoed through conservative circles, casting her efforts in a shadow of suspicion and fear. One afternoon, Marsha decided to take a walk through the neighborhood near the precinct. She wanted to see the city beyond the reports and statistics, to experience it as the people who lived here did. As she moved down the streets, she passed small shops and bustling sidewalks. She caught a few wary glances, the kind reserved for strangers and those who didn't quite belong. But she also noticed the quiet nods, the appreciative looks from those who understood what she was trying to do. A young woman approached her as she paused outside a coffee shop. She looked hesitant, her eyes bright with a mix of gratitude and apprehension. "Excuse me, are you Chief Wilson?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Marsha nodded, offering her a warm smile. "Yes, that's me." The woman's face softened with relief, and she extended her hand. "My name's Tasha. I just wanted to say, thank you. For everything you're doing. For people like me." Marsha shook her hand, feeling a swell of emotion she hadn't expected. Tasha went on, her voice gaining confidence. "My brother, he was pulled over last year. He hadn't done anything wrong. But they treated him like he was guilty just because of how he looked. He came home that night, shaken. It broke something in him. I didn't think anyone would ever try to change things." Marsha felt the weight of Tasha's words settle over her. A reminder of the invisible wounds that discrimination left behind. She reached out, placing a reassuring hand on Tasha's shoulder. "I can't change the past," she said softly. "But I'm here to make sure that no one else has to go through that. Change takes time. But it's people like you, your courage, your story, that make it all worth it." Tasha's eyes glistened, and she nodded. holding Marsha's hand tightly for a moment before letting go. Marsha watched her walk away, her heart heavier but more determined than ever. She knew that for every person who thanked her, there were countless others who carried scars unseen, stories untold. And it was for them that she would continue. As Marsha walked further, she saw the neighborhood in a new light. She noticed the subtle signs of wear, the hints of distrust in the eyes of people watching the street corners. The teenagers gathered in wary groups. She understood that they weren't only watching her, they were watching the department, gauging if this new chief was truly different. Returning to the precinct, Marsha called a meeting with her senior officers. She wanted them to see what she'd seen, to understand why their work mattered beyond the walls of the precinct. This isn't just about policies and protocols, she began, her voice steady, carrying the weight of Tasha's story. It's about rebuilding trust with the people we serve. They need to know that we're here to protect them, not intimidate them. She noticed a few skeptical glances exchanged among the officers, especially from veterans like Randall Pierce, who still clung to his resistance. But she also saw nods from those who had started to believe in her vision. Officer Tyler Jennings, in particular, looked at her with a glint of respect, a silent affirmation that her message was resonating with at least some of them. Pierce cleared his throat, breaking the silence. With all due respect, Chief, not everyone in this city wants change. Some people are happy with how things are. They don't see a problem. Marsha met his gaze, undeterred. That's exactly why we need to change, Officer Pierce. Ignoring a problem doesn't make it disappear. This city deserves better. And we're going to show them that we're more than just enforcers. We're protectors, guardians of their trust. Pierce held her stare for a moment before looking away, his expression unreadable. She knew he would be one of the hardest to win over. But she was determined. He was part of her team, and she wasn't giving up on him. Just as she wasn't giving up on the city. Over the next few weeks, Marsha's influence began to ripple through the community. Word spread of her hands-on approach, her insistence on accountability, her regular walks through the neighborhoods. Slowly, people began to approach her, sharing their stories, their grievances, their hopes. Each story fueled her determination, each conversation a reminder of the stakes of her mission. Local media picked up on her efforts, dubbing her the People's Chief, a title that brought both praise and criticism. Some hailed her as a champion of justice, someone willing to confront the biases entrenched within the department. Others, especially those with influence and old connections to the precinct, labeled her as a disruptor, a threat to their way of life. One evening, Marsha received a call from the mayor. His tone was cautious, laced with the kind of political diplomacy she'd expected. Chief Wilson, he began. I've been hearing mixed responses about the changes you're making. I hope you understand that while progress is good, stability is also important to this city. Marsha listened, choosing her words carefully. With all due respect, Mr. Mayor, stability that rests on complacency isn't true stability. The people want accountability, and they deserve it. I won't compromise on that. The mayor was silent for a moment, his hesitation palpable. Finally, he replied, just be careful, Chief. Not everyone sees things the way you do. Marsha ended the call, feeling the pressure mounting, the weight of expectations pressing down on her shoulders. But she remained resolute. She hadn't come here to be popular or to keep the peace for those who preferred the status quo. She had come to make a difference, and no amount of resistance would deter her. The next day, Marsha stood before her officers once again, her gaze fierce, unwavering. Some of you may feel like the changes we're making are a threat to what you know, she began, her voice echoing through the room. But ask yourselves this, what are we really here for? To uphold our own sense of power? Or to serve and protect? With dignity, fairness, and justice? Silence hung heavy in the air as her words resonated with each officer. She knew that not all of them would come around, that some might never embrace her vision. But she saw the flickers of change, the spark of something new taking root. As she looked out at her team, Marsha knew that this was only the beginning. There would be challenges ahead, more battles to face, more resistance. But she was here, standing in her truth, guided by the stories of people like Tasha and the hopes of a city that needed healing. And as she left the room, she felt a sense of purpose more powerful than ever. This was her city now, her mission, her legacy to build. And she was just getting started. The precinct felt different now. Weeks of Marsha's influence had carved out new spaces in the minds of the officers. Spaces filled with curiosity, caution, and a hesitant respect. Though not everyone had been swayed, the shift in culture was undeniable. There was a new code in the air, one of fairness, one that required everyone to think twice about their actions. As part of her reform, Marsha introduced a community outreach initiative, encouraging officers to spend time in neighborhoods they had once only driven through with suspicion. She wanted them to see the people they served as more than reports and statistics. She knew that real change wouldn't come from behind desks or policy memos, it had to be lived, breathed, felt. One Saturday morning, Marsha organized a Meet the Precinct event in a park near one of the city's most underserved neighborhoods. She arrived early, her heart thrumming with both excitement and trepidation. This was a chance to bridge the gap, to invite the community into a space of trust that had long been broken. Tables were set up with information on resources, local support organizations, and programs for families. Officers were stationed at different areas, not in uniforms, but in casual clothes to encourage approachability. As residents began to filter in, Marsha noticed the wariness in their eyes. Many kept their distance, hesitant to come closer, their glances laced with skepticism. But she welcomed each person who approached, shaking hands, listening to their concerns. She saw the faces of people who had been through countless injustices, people who had been stopped and questioned for no reason, people who had lost faith in the system long ago. A group of teenagers lingered at the edge of the park, watching everything unfold with crossed arms and guarded expressions. Marsha walked over, hands in her pockets, her smile easy and welcoming. "Hey there," she said, nodding toward them. "You guys thinking of coming over?" One of the boys shrugged. His eyes narrowed. "What's the point? Cops don't care about us." Marsha looked at him, sensing the years of mistrust and hurt woven into his words. "I get it," she said quietly. "There's a lot that needs to change. But that's why we're here, why I'm here. I can't promise everything will be perfect overnight. But I'm willing to listen. And I'll do everything I can to make sure this precinct respects every single person in this city, including you." The boy looked at her, searching her face for any hint of insincerity. Finally, he nodded, and the group slowly made their way over to the tables, where officers greeted them with tentative smiles. It wasn't a full breakthrough, but it was a start, a step toward something better. Marsha moved through the crowd, stopping to chat with parents, listening to stories of long-standing grievances, and connecting people with resources for employment, housing, and mental health. She could see the walls beginning to come down, the seeds of trust being planted, and it renewed her hope. Then, as she was speaking with a mother of 3, she felt a tap on her shoulder. Turning, she came face to face with Randall Pierce. The seasoned officer looked uncomfortable, his hands jammed into his pockets, his eyes flicking around before landing on her. "Chief," he said, his voice tight. "Got a minute?" Marsha nodded, surprised, and they stepped aside to a quieter spot beneath a tree. Pierce took a deep breath, visibly struggling with what he was about to say. I didn't get it at first," he admitted, his tone begrudging but genuine. "This whole idea of community outreach, all these changes, it felt like you were undermining everything I'd worked for. But watching today, seeing how these people are actually responding, I think I was wrong." Marsha regarded him for a moment, a warmth blossoming in her chest. This was the same man who had resisted her every step, who had fought her changes tooth and nail. And now, here he was, a glimmer of humility in his eyes. "I appreciate that, Pierce," she said softly. "I know change isn't easy, especially when it feels like someone's coming in to rewrite everything you know. But this is our chance to do something good, to make a difference beyond just enforcing the law. We're building a partnership with the people we serve." Pierce nodded slowly, looking out at the crowd, his expression pensive. "I can see that now," he murmured. "Maybe it's time for all of us to rethink things." Marsha felt a surge of hope, tempered by the reality of the work still ahead. "It's not going to be easy," she said, her voice steady. "There will be more resistance, more moments where it feels like we're getting nowhere. But as long as we keep moving forward, one step at a time, we can make this precinct something the city is proud of." Pierce nodded, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "Guess I'll be seeing you at more of these then, Chief." She smiled back, feeling the weight of his words and what they represented. "I'll count on it." As the day wound down, Marsha watched the crowd thinning, people leaving with a sense of cautious optimism. She had seen the power of what they could accomplish if they worked together, if they truly committed to bridging the gap between law enforcement and the community. This wasn't just a job for her, it was a mission, a calling, a promise to the people she had vowed to protect. When she finally returned to the precinct that evening, she found herself alone in the quiet stillness of her office. She let out a long breath, exhaustion settling over her. But it was the kind of exhaustion that came from purpose, from knowing that she was exactly where she was meant to be. She glanced at a small framed photo on her desk, a picture of her as a young recruit, standing proudly in her first uniform. She had come a long way since then. Through countless battles, both external and internal. And now, standing on the edge of change, she felt that young recruit's ambition renewed within her. A reminder of why she had chosen this path in the first place. Marsha knew that there would be more challenges ahead. More people who would question her motives. More barriers to break down. But she also knew that the tide was turning. That the walls were coming down. And that this precinct, this city, was on the brink of something profound. As she sat there, bathed in the quiet glow of the office lights, Marsha whispered a promise to herself and to the city that had become her own: this is only the beginning. And with that, she was ready for whatever came next. The changes Marsha had sparked in the precinct were finally beginning to take root. Not only in policy but in spirit. Each day, she noticed her officers carrying themselves differently. With a sense of purpose that was less about authority and more about service. They walked the streets with a growing respect for the communities they once saw as distant. Even suspicious. Slowly, bonds of trust were being formed. And Marsha felt the pulse of transformation beating steadily through the city. But the true test of her reforms came one chilly October night. Marsha had just returned to her office from a long evening meeting with the mayor, who was finally acknowledging the positive impact of her initiatives. Her phone buzzed, a message from dispatch: disturbance reported in Oakwood District. Possible gang activity. Officers en route. Oakwood was known as one of the most vulnerable neighborhoods in the city, plagued by issues that went deeper than law enforcement could solve alone. Yet tonight, Marsha sensed that this call was different. Without hesitation, she grabbed her coat and headed to the scene, her gut telling her she needed to be there. Not as a chief behind a desk but as a leader on the ground. When she arrived, flashing lights painted the street in urgent shades of red and blue. A crowd had gathered outside an old apartment building, tense and murmuring with fear and frustration. The air was thick with tension, the kind that could easily snap into chaos. She spotted Officer Tyler Jennings, one of her strongest supporters, standing with his partner near the crowd, trying to calm people down. Marsha approached him, noting the uncertainty in his eyes. "Chief," he greeted her with relief. "We've got reports of gang members inside. But the residents are upset. They're scared we'll use force. And it's getting tense out here." Marsha nodded, surveying the crowd. She could see the fear in the faces of mothers clutching their children, young men with arms crossed defensively, and elderly residents standing helplessly by. They'd seen this story play out before: heavy-handed policing, indiscriminate arrests. Their community left with even more wounds to heal. Taking a deep breath, Marsha stepped forward, raising her voice enough to command the crowd's attention. "Everyone, please, listen," she called out. The murmurs quieted, all eyes turning toward her. Some wary, others hopeful. "I know you're worried, but I promise, we're not here to harm anyone. We're here to keep you safe." A woman near the front, her face lined with exhaustion and fear, spoke up. "You say that, but it's always the same. People go in and don't come out. This isn't protecting us." Marsha felt the weight of those words but met the woman's gaze with steady resolve. "I understand," she said softly, but firmly. "Tonight will be different. We're here to protect, not to harm. And I'll be right here, making sure we follow that promise." Turning to her officers, Marsha gave quiet instructions, her voice calm but authoritative. "No one moves in without my say. We're de-escalating this, no force. Only calm conversation." As her officers organized, Marsha felt a hand on her shoulder and turned to see Randall Pierce. He looked at her, a spark of respect in his eyes that hadn't been there before. "What do you need me to do, Chief?" he asked. His tone no longer filled with doubt but with a readiness to serve. Marsha smiled, feeling the enormity of the shift between them. "I need you to help keep the crowd calm," she replied. "Let's show them we're here for them, not against them." With Pierce's help, Marsha approached the door of the apartment building. She knocked, her movements slow and respectful. After a few moments, the door opened a crack, and a young man looked out, his face guarded and suspicious. "We're here to talk. That's all," she assured him, her voice gentle but firm. "No one's here to arrest you. We just want to keep everyone safe tonight." The young man hesitated, glancing at the officers and then at the crowd outside, before nodding and allowing Marsha to step inside. Tyler and a couple of officers followed, keeping their hands visible, their body language calm. Inside, the tension was palpable. A small group of teenagers hovered near the back, their faces hard, their postures defensive. Marsha recognized the fear behind their eyes, the same fear that had greeted her on her first day in the city. The fear of not being understood, of being treated as a threat. "Listen," Marsha said, her voice warm but unyielding. I know you're scared. But we're not here to hurt you. We're here because we care about what happens to this neighborhood. And that includes you. One of the boys, his jaw clenched, looked at her defiantly. What's to stop you from locking us up anyway? Marsha took a step closer, her eyes meeting his. Because I'm the chief of police. And I'm promising you right here that I'm not here to arrest you. I'm here to help this community find peace. The boy's face softened, his stance relaxing just slightly. The others exchanged glances, their defenses wavering. Marsha continued, her voice filled with conviction. If you need help, we can find a way. But it has to start with trust. Give us a chance to show you we're different. The silence that followed was thick. But in that moment, something shifted. The boys nodded, not fully trusting yet, but willing to consider the possibility. Marsha felt a surge of relief, knowing that the first bridge had been built. They stepped outside, and the crowd watched as Marsha led the teenagers out without handcuffs, without force. The relief in the community was tangible, and she could see people nodding, talking amongst themselves, realizing that this time, things truly had been different. The night air was cool as Marsha gathered her officers together, a small but weary smile on her face. This is what policing should be, she said quietly, her voice carrying a pride she couldn't contain. Tonight, we protected without fear. We listened without judgment. And we showed this community that we're here for them. This is what we stand for. The officers nodded, some visibly moved, others thoughtful. Randall Pierce approached her, shaking his head in something like awe. I never thought I'd see the day, he murmured, his voice low. But I'm proud to be here. Proud to be part of this. Marsha nodded, feeling the weight of his words settle into her heart. This was more than a victory, it was proof that change, real change, was possible. It took persistence, compassion, and an unshakable belief in the power of unity. As the crowd dispersed and the neighborhood settled into the calm of night, Marsha walked back to her car, exhaustion weighing heavily on her but her spirit buoyant. She looked back at the precinct in the distance, feeling a profound sense of pride. They had come a long way from where they'd started, and while there was still a long road ahead, tonight had proven that they were capable of so much more than they'd ever imagined. Marsha drove home in the quiet of the city, a city that was slowly healing, a city that was finally beginning to trust. And as she turned onto her street, she knew that this journey, this fight for justice, unity, and dignity, was only just beginning.